The morning of April 15th, 1944, a single Dakota transport aircraft sat on the rain-soaked tarmac at Brindisi airfield in southern Italy, its propellers still. Inside the cockpit, Flight Lieutenant Kazimierz Szrajer wiped condensation from the instrument panel with hands that had not stopped shaking since the briefing ended 2 hours earlier. Outside, British ground crews moved between the shadows, their voices deliberately low, as if speaking too loudly might alert the entire German Wehrmacht to what was about to happen. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Szrajer was Polish, not British, despite the RAF uniform he wore. Not Italian, despite the Mediterranean sun that would soon rise behind him. He was a man without a country, flying for an air force that was not his own, about to attempt something that every regulation in the Royal Air Force explicitly forbade. He was about to fly 1,500 kilometers into German-occupied territory, land on a makeshift strip carved from Polish farmland, and attempt to bring back men who were not supposed to exist. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This was not supposed to happen. Military doctrine in 1944 was clear. Transport aircraft did not fly deep into enemy territory without fighter escort. Pilots did not land on unverified airstrips in the dark. The RAF did not risk valuable aircraft and trained crews on missions with survival odds measured in single digits. Yet here was Szrajer, 32 years old, a veteran of 22 bombing operations over Germany, preparing to break every rule in the manual for a mission that officially did not exist. The reason was simple and terrible. Somewhere in the forests south of Warsaw, 9 aircrew members were trapped behind enemy lines, not shot down over Yugoslavia where the Chetniks might hide them, not bailed out over France where the resistance could smuggle them to Spain. These men were in Poland, deep in the heartland of the German occupation, where the Gestapo controlled every village and the SS hunted partisans with methodical brutality. The Polish Home Army, the Armia Krajowa, had been sheltering these airmen for weeks, moving them from safe house to safe house, one step ahead of German patrols. But the net was closing. The Gestapo had informers everywhere. Every day the airmen remained increased, the risk not just to themselves but to the Polish families hiding them. Families who would be shot, their homes burned, their villages razed if the Germans discovered what they had done. London knew about the trapped airmen. The Air Ministry knew. The problem was that nobody could figure out how to get them out. Yugoslavia had established rescue procedures, improvised airstrips, OSS teams on the ground coordinating with local fighters, but Poland, in the spring of 1944, was a different world. It was the fortress heart of the Nazi Empire, garrisoned by hundreds of thousands of troops, crisscrossed by Wehrmacht convoys, patrolled by Luftwaffe fighters that would shoot down anything that moved without proper identification codes. The distance alone made it impossible. 1,500 kilometers from Brindisi to the landing zone south of Warsaw. 3,000 kilometers round trip. The Dakota's maximum range with standard fuel load was 2,700 kilometers. The mathematics were simple and unforgiving. The aircraft could not reach Poland and return to Italy. Not without additional fuel tanks. Not without modifications that the Air Ministry had not authorized. Not without breaking regulations that existed for very good reasons. But Szrajer was not asking for permission. Neither were the handful of British and Polish officers who had been planning this mission in secret for 3 months. They called it Operation Wildhorn Three, the third in a series of clandestine flights into occupied Poland. The first 2 missions had been intelligence operations, delivering agents and retrieving documents. This one was different. This one was about bringing people home. The planners understood what they were asking. They were asking a pilot to fly a slow, unarmed transport aircraft through the most heavily defended airspace in Europe, to navigate without radio aids, using only dead reckoning and a prayer that the weather would hold. To find a landing strip that was nothing more than a grass field marked by handheld torches, assuming the reception committee was even there and had not been captured by the Germans. To land in total darkness, load passengers, and take off again, all within 15 minutes before German night fighters could locate them. If anything went wrong, the crew would be on their own. There would be no rescue, no fighter escort to bail them out, no emergency airfields where they could divert. They would be 1,500 kilometers behind enemy lines, in a slow transport plane that the Luftwaffe could tear apart in seconds. If they were shot down, if they crashed, if they were captured, the RAF would deny all knowledge of the mission. The official record would show nothing. The men would simply disappear. Szrajer knew all of this. He had known it since the moment squadron leader Pickard called him into the briefing room at RAF Tempsford 3 days earlier and spread the maps across the table. The flight path was a ragged line snaking northeast across the Adriatic, over the Balkans, across Hungary, into the southern borders of occupied Poland. Every kilometre of that route was contested airspace. Yugoslav partisans fought Germans in the mountains. Hungarian air defences protected the oil fields at Ploesti. German night fighters prowled the skies above Poland, hunting for Soviet bombers making the long flight from Russia. The planners had chosen the Dakota for a reason. It was reliable, sturdy, capable of landing on rough fields. It could carry the weight, but it was also painfully slow, cruising at barely 200 kilometers per hour. That meant nearly 15 hours in the air for the round trip, 15 hours of exposure, 15 hours of vulnerability, 15 hours during which absolutely everything had to go perfectly, or everyone aboard would die. The modifications had been made in secrecy. Extra fuel tanks welded into the cargo bay, reducing passenger capacity but extending range. Navigation equipment calibrated for the long flight over unfamiliar terrain. The ball turret removed to save weight. No defensive armament. If they encountered German fighters, their only option would be to dive for the ground and pray they could find cloud cover or darkness. Szrajer walked slowly around the Dakota, checking the control surfaces, the tires, the propellers. This was ritual now, something he did before every flight. His hands moved automatically, feeling for loose rivets, checking for hydraulic leaks, testing the tension in the cables. The ground crew watched him with expressions caught between respect and pity. They knew where he was going. They knew the odds. One of the crew chiefs, a sergeant from Manchester named Williams, approached with a thermos of coffee. "Reckon you'll be needing this, sir," he said quietly. His voice carried the flat acceptance of a man who had seen too many crews not come back. Szrajer took the thermos and nodded. There was nothing to say. Williams understood. They all understood. Inside the operations hut, the final weather briefing was underway. The meteorologist, a pale young lieutenant who looked like he had never left university, pointed to the charts with a trembling finger. "Cloud cover over the Adriatic should hold until dawn," he said. "Light winds at altitude. Some turbulence expected over the mountains, but nothing severe. The moon will set at 0200 hours, giving you approximately 4 hours of complete darkness over the target area." 4 hours. It sounded like nothing at all. Szrajer studied the maps again, memorizing landmarks, alternate routes, emergency procedures he knew would be useless if things went wrong. The landing zone was marked with a small circle in red pencil, a grass field near the village of Tarnów, 200 kilometers south of Warsaw. The Home Army had selected it because it was remote, surrounded by forest, away from major roads where German patrols might spot activity. The reception committee would be waiting with signal lamps, 3 white lights arranged in an L shape marking the landing direction. If the Germans had discovered the plan, if the Home Army team had been captured, there would be no lights, just darkness and whatever trap the Gestapo had prepared. Szrajer would have perhaps 30 seconds to recognize the danger and pull up before machine gun fire tore through the Dakota's thin aluminum skin. The intelligence officer, a Major Thompson who wore the ribbons of service in North Africa and Sicily, cleared his throat. "The passengers are ready," he said. His voice carried the weight of a man delivering both orders and an apology. 9 airmen, 7 Americans, 2 British. They've been in hiding for 3 weeks. The Home Army reports they're in reasonable health, though one of the Americans has dysentery and another has a partially healed leg fracture from his bailout. Szrajer looked up sharply. "Will they be able to move quickly?" Thompson's expression did not change. They'll have to. There was silence in the room. Everyone understood what that meant. If German patrols showed up during the loading, there would be no time for hesitation. The Dakota would take off with whoever was aboard. Anyone left behind would face interrogation, torture, and execution. The Polish families who had hidden them would suffer the same fate. The mission commander, Wing Commander Pickard, leaned forward. He was a veteran of dozens of special operations flights, a man whose face carried the lines of too many sleepless nights and too many crews lost. Kazimierz, he said, using the Polish pronunciation carefully. You understand this is voluntary. You can walk away right now. No questions asked. No mark on your record. Szrajer met his eyes. Those men are counting on someone to bring them home, he said simply. If not me, then who? Pickard nodded slowly. He had expected this answer. Polish pilots had earned a reputation in the RAF that bordered on legend. They flew missions that British pilots refused. They pressed attacks that British doctrine considered suicidal. They had lost their country, their families, everything except the war. For them, there was no such thing as too dangerous. There was only the mission. The Home Army will have fuel cached at the landing zone, Thompson continued. Enough to top off your tanks for the return flight. The refueling procedure will add approximately 20 minutes to your ground time. The reception committee understands the risk. 20 minutes. On the ground. In occupied Poland, with German garrisons within 10 kilometers in every direction. Szrajer felt his stomach tighten. This was not a rescue mission. This was a race against time, against probability, against every factor that could go wrong in a situation where everything was already impossible. The briefing ended at 0300 hours. Outside, the first hints of false dawn touched the eastern sky. The Dakota's engines coughed, caught, roared to life. The sound echoed across the airfield, deep and powerful and somehow inadequate for what it was being asked to do. Szrajer climbed into the cockpit, settled into the pilot's seat, began the pre-flight checklist with hands that moved through pure muscle memory. His co-pilot for this mission was Flight Lieutenant Stanley, a quiet Englishman from Cornwall who had flown transport missions over Burma before transferring to the Mediterranean. Stanley said nothing as he worked through his own checklist, but Szrajer could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes kept flicking to the fuel gauges as if willing them to show more than they did. The navigator, Sergeant Davies, squeezed into his station behind the cockpit. He was Welsh, 23 years old, with a gift for dead reckoning that bordered on supernatural. He would be their eyes through the darkness, plotting their course by stars and compass, and an internal sense of direction that Szrajer had learned to trust absolutely. If they made it to Poland and back, it would be because Davies guided them through 1,500 kilometers of hostile sky without error. The radio operator, Corporal Wilson, settled into his position by the wireless set. His role was perhaps the most dangerous of all. Radio silence would be mandatory for most of the flight, but once they reached the landing zone, he would have to break silence, transmit the recognition codes to the Home Army reception team, confirm the identity of the people they were evacuating. One wrong code, one German listener on the right frequency, and fighters would be scrambled from every airfield within 100 kilometers. At 0345 hours, clearance came from the tower. Szrajer released the brakes, advanced the throttles, felt the Dakota begin its roll down the runway. The aircraft was heavy with the extra fuel, sluggish in its response. The airspeed indicator crept upward with agonizing slowness. 80 kilometers per hour, 100, 120. At 140 the nose lifted, and then they were climbing, breaking free of the earth, the lights of Brindisi falling away beneath them. Szrajer turned northeast, following the course Davies had plotted. Below them, the Adriatic spread like hammered metal under the stars. Ahead lay everything unknown. Hostile territory, German fighters, anti-aircraft batteries, weather that could change without warning, navigation errors that could put them hundreds of kilometers off course with no way to correct, mechanical failures that would leave them dead stick over mountains or forests with no place to land. But also ahead, in a forest clearing south of Warsaw, 9 men waited in the darkness, 9 airmen who had flown against Germany until their aircraft failed them, who had been sheltered by Polish families at immense risk, who believed, against all evidence, that someone would come, that the men they had fought beside would not abandon them, that the war, with all its cruelty and waste, still held room for honour. Szrajer checked his instruments, trimmed the aircraft for cruise, settled in for the long flight north. Stanley monitored the fuel consumption with the intensity of a man watching his own lifeblood drain away. Davies worked his charts under a shielded light, making minute corrections to their heading. Wilson sat silent by his radio, headphones clamped over his ears, listening for any transmission that might indicate they had been detected. The coast of Yugoslavia passed beneath them, 2 hours into the flight. Below, fires burned in the mountains where partisan groups fought German occupation forces. The war down there was different from the war they fought in the air, more personal, more brutal. Villages that sheltered resistance fighters were burned to the ground. Civilians were executed in reprisal for every German soldier killed. The rules that supposedly governed warfare had broken down completely, replaced by a savagery that shocked even hardened veterans. Hungary appeared as a darker shadow against the darkness, a landscape of farms and small towns, and the occasional cluster of lights that marked a garrison or an airfield. Szrajer descended to 500 meters, low enough to stay under radar coverage but high enough to clear the mountains. The Dakota shuddered through, patches of turbulence, the wings flexing, the airframe creaking. Each jolt sent his hand reflexively to the throttles, ready to add power if an engine faltered. At 0630 hours, Davies tapped him on the shoulder and pointed to a landmark on the map, a distinctive bend in the Danube River, gleaming silver in the pre-dawn light. They were on course. Exactly on course. Szrajer felt some of the tension ease from his shoulders. If their navigation held, if the weather cooperated, if the Germans did not spot them, they would reach the landing zone at 0700 hours, just as full darkness returned and the moon set below the horizon. "Fuel check," Szrajer called over the intercom. Stanley consulted his calculations. "Consumption is higher than planned," he said. His voice was carefully neutral, but Szrajer heard the concern beneath it. "Headwinds are stronger than forecast. We're burning an additional 20 litres per hour." 20 litres per hour, over a 15-hour mission. That was 300 litres, nearly a quarter of their reserve. Szrajer did the mathematics in his head. They would still have enough to reach Poland and return to Italy, but the margin had shrunk to almost nothing. Any additional headwinds, any detours around weather or German activity, and they would not make it back. They would run dry somewhere over the Balkans and have to ditch or crash land in hostile territory. But turning back was not an option. Not now. Not with 9 men counting on them. Szrajer increased the throttle slightly, trading fuel for speed, trying to reduce the exposure time. The engines responded with a deeper roar, and the airspeed crept upward. Every kilometre per hour cost them fuel they could not spare, but every minute in the air was a minute the Germans might spot them. The border of occupied Poland passed beneath them at 0650 hours. There were no signs, no markers, just a gradual change in the terrain below. More forests, fewer lights, an air, emptiness that spoke of a land under the boot of occupation. Szrajer felt a tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with the danger they faced. This was his homeland down there. These were his people. The villages he could see in the fading darkness might hold families he had known before the war, before the Wehrmacht came, before everything changed. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Davies leaned forward, his voice tight with concentration. Target area in 15 minutes. Descending to 300 meters for visual identification. Szrajer eased the Dakota down through the darkness. The aircraft was sluggish now, heavy with fuel that had not yet burned, responsive to his controls but with a reluctance that spoke of weight and fatigue. Below them, the Polish countryside spread like a patchwork quilt of fields and forests, all rendered in shades of grey by the fading moonlight. Somewhere in that landscape, 9 men huddled in a farmhouse or a forest shelter, listening for the sound of engines, praying that what they heard would be salvation and not death. The landing zone was supposed to be marked. 3 white signal lamps arranged in an L shape, pointing into the wind, showing the direction for final approach. But as they crossed the coordinates Davies had calculated, Szrajer saw only darkness. No lights, no signals. Nothing but empty fields and the black mass of surrounding forest. Stanley's hand moved to the throttles. Abort! His voice carried the weight of a man hoping for that order, knowing the alternative. Szrajer circled once, banking the Dakota in a wide turn that exposed them to anyone watching from the ground. German or Polish, friend or enemy, they would hear the engines now. There was no stealth left, no hiding. They were committed. Below them, something flickered. Once, twice, 3 times. White light in the darkness. Contact, Wilson said from his radio position. I have the recognition signal. The lights appeared then, 3 points of white arranged in the promised L shape, but they were faint, barely visible, as if the people holding them were terrified to show even that much illumination. Szrajer lined up his approach, reduced throttle, extended flaps. The Dakota descended toward the field with a gentleness that felt obscene given the circumstances. This should be violent, this should be screaming and fire. Instead, it was just the whisper of wind over wings and the slow descent toward Polish soil. The ground rushed up to meet them. Grass field, just as promised, but rough and uneven in ways the briefing had not mentioned. The Dakota's wheels touched, bounced, touched again. The aircraft shuddered, the tail wheel slammed down, and then they were rolling across the field, the rough terrain threatening to tear the landing gear from the fuselage. Szrajer fought the controls, keeping the wings level, bleeding off speed, bringing the aircraft to a stop barely 50 meters from the tree line. He killed the engines immediately. The sudden silence was absolute and terrifying. No engine roar to mask their presence, no thunder of propellers to drown out approaching vehicles. Just silence and the tick of cooling metal and the distant sound of dogs barking in a village that was too close, far too close. Stanley had his hand on the door release before the props stopped turning. He jumped down to the grass, and immediately figures emerged from the forest. Not 9 men, dozens. Polish Home Army soldiers in mismatched uniforms, farmers with hunting rifles, women carrying bundles of what looked like food. They moved with the practiced silence of people who had learned that sound meant death. A man approached Szrajer as he climbed down from the cockpit. Middle-aged, weathered face, eyes that had seen too much. He spoke in rapid Polish. Major Kowalski, Armia Krajowa. The airmen are ready. We have fuel as promised. 20 minutes, no more. German patrol passed through the next village 1 hour ago. They will return at dawn. 20 minutes. Szrajer checked his watch. 7:15 hours. Dawn was in 45 minutes. They would be racing the sun, racing the Germans, racing the fuel consumption that had already eaten into their reserves. Bring the airmen, he said. Begin refueling immediately. The scene that unfolded in that Polish field was something from a fever dream. Home Army soldiers rolled barrels of aviation fuel from hiding places in the forest, working with practiced efficiency to pump it into the Dakota's tanks. The refueling was manual, primitive, done with hand pumps and rubber hoses that leaked precious fuel onto the grass. Other soldiers formed a perimeter, weapons pointed outward, listening for the sound of approaching vehicles. The 9 airmen emerged from the forest in a line, shepherded by Polish guides. 7 Americans, 2 British, exactly as briefed. But seeing them was different from reading about them in an intelligence report. They were gaunt, hollow-eyed, their uniforms in tatters. The American with the leg fracture limped badly, supported by 2 of his crew. The one with dysentery moved with the careful gait of a man whose body had betrayed him. But they were alive. Against all odds, sheltered by people who owed them nothing, they had survived. The American ranking officer, a captain named Morrison from the insignia barely visible on his torn jacket, approached Szrajer with something like disbelief in his eyes. You actually came, he said. His voice cracked. We thought, Jesus Christ, you actually came. We're leaving in 15 minutes. But even as he said it, he knew they had a problem. The refueling was taking too long. The hand pumps were slow, the hoses primitive. Major Kowalski worked alongside his men, his face grim with the knowledge that every minute they remained on the ground increased the risk exponentially. Dawn was coming. German patrols would be moving with the light. Any farmer in the area could report the aircraft. Any collaborator could telephone the Gestapo. Stanley appeared at Szrajer's side. "We're only half refueled," he said quietly. "At this rate, we need another 20 minutes minimum." 20 minutes they did not have. Szrajer made the calculation instantly. Half fuel meant they could not make it back to Italy. Not with the headwinds they had encountered. They would run dry somewhere over Hungary or Yugoslavia, but there was an alternative, a desperate one. Several Allied-held airfields in southern Yugoslavia, seized from the Germans just months earlier. If they could reach one of those, if the fields were operational, if German fighters did not intercept them over the mountains. "Load the men," Szrajer ordered. "We leave with what fuel we have." Morrison heard the exchange. "You're saying we can't make it back? I'm saying we leave now or we don't leave at all. German patrol is coming." As if to punctuate his words, one of the Home Army sentries came running from the perimeter. He spoke urgently to Major Kowalski, who turned pale even in the darkness. "Vehicles," Kowalski said. 2 kilometers east, possibly 3. They scrambled aboard the Dakota with the desperate energy of men who understood they were seconds from death or capture. The Home Army soldiers abandoned the refueling, dragging the hoses away from the aircraft, rolling the barrels back toward the forest. But there was no time to hide everything. Fuel stains darkened the grass. Tire tracks marked where the aircraft had landed. At first light, the Germans would know exactly what had happened here. Major Kowalski gripped Szrajer's hand. "Go," he said. "Go now. We will delay them. They'll kill you. We are already dead, my friend. Have been since 1939. You just gave 9 families in England and America their sons back. That is worth dying for." There was no time to argue, no time for anything but action. Szrajer pulled himself back into the cockpit, his hands moving through the engine start sequence with practiced speed. The left engine coughed, caught, the right engine followed. The propellers bit into the air, and suddenly they were moving, rolling across the rough field, the Dakota shaking violently over the uneven ground. Behind them, in the forest, muzzle flashes appeared. The Home Army had engaged the German patrol, buying them seconds with their lives. Szrajer did not look back, could not look back. The aircraft needed all his attention. The rough field, the inadequate takeoff run, the weight of 9 passengers and half-empty fuel tanks that shifted the aircraft's center of gravity in ways the designers had never intended. The trees at the end of the field rushed toward them. 60 kilometers per hour, 80, 100. The Dakota was heavy, reluctant to fly. The tail lifted, but the main wheels stayed glued to the earth. 120, 130. The trees were 50 meters away. Stanley's hand hovered over the landing gear retraction lever, his face frozen in an expression caught between hope and resignation. At 140 kilometers per hour, with 20 meters between them and the forest, Szrajer pulled back on the yoke. The Dakota clawed into the air, wings shaking, engines screaming at maximum power. The top branches of the trees passed beneath them with meters to spare. A few leaves struck the fuselage with sounds like hailstones. Then they were climbing, leaving behind the field and the forest and the sound of gunfire that was already fading into the distance. In the cargo bay, the 9 airmen sat in silence, too exhausted or traumatized to speak. They had seen the muzzle flashes. They understood what was happening on the ground below them. Polish soldiers were dying so that they could live. Families, who had sheltered them, would face interrogation, torture, execution, if the Germans connected them to the rescue. The mathematics of war had never been so clear or so terrible. Stanley checked the fuel gauges and did calculations that made his face go grey. "We have approximately 4 hours of fuel," he said. "That puts us somewhere over central Yugoslavia. I can plot courses to 3 possible landing sites. 2 are confirmed, Allied-controlled. The third is uncertain." "Plot them all," Szrajer said. He kept his voice steady, but his mind was racing through scenarios. 4 hours. The distance to the Yugoslav partisan airfields was approximately 800 kilometers. They could make it if the winds cooperated, if they encountered no German fighters, if the airfields were actually operational and not just names on outdated maps. Davies worked his navigation charts under the shielded light, making calculations, adjusting for winds aloft, plotting alternate routes around known German air defense positions. Wilson monitored the radio frequencies, listening for any transmission that might indicate they had been detected, that fighters had been scrambled, that their brief window of escape was closing. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Dawn broke as they crossed back into Hungary. The sky turned from black to grey to a pale blue that seemed obscenely beautiful given the circumstances. Below them, the countryside woke to another day of occupation. Villages where people would report to factories, farms where labour would be extracted at gunpoint, garrison towns where German soldiers would drink coffee and plan the day's operations, unaware that a lone transport aircraft carrying rescued airmen was flying over their heads. The fuel situation deteriorated with every kilometre. The headwinds that had plagued them on the inbound flight showed no mercy on the Tartu return. Stanley recalculated their position constantly, each time delivering news that was marginally worse than before. 3 hours, 45 minutes of fuel. 3 hours, 30 minutes. 3 hours, 15. At 0900 hours, they reached the Yugoslav border. Somewhere below them, partisan forces controlled pockets of territory, fought running battles with German garrisons, provided safe haven for crashed Allied airmen. But finding those friendly zones from the air was nearly impossible. The front lines shifted daily. What was partisan territory yesterday might be German-occupied today. Davies pointed to a position on his map. "Airfield at Vis Island," he said. "Confirmed, Allied controlled, as of 3 days ago. RAF fighter squadron based there. It's our best option. Distance? 450 kilometers, approximately 2 hours 20 minutes, at current speed and heading." Stanley looked at the fuel gauges. "We have 2 hours 10 minutes. Maybe." Maybe. The word hung in the cockpit like smoke. Maybe they would make it. Maybe the gauges were pessimistic. Maybe the winds would shift in their favour. Maybe the engine would keep running even after the last drop of fuel left the tanks, carried forward by momentum and prayer and the desperate will of everyone aboard. Szrajer adjusted their heading, pointing the Dakota southwest toward the Adriatic. The aircraft felt lighter now, the fuel tanks gradually emptying, the weight falling away. But that lightness was deceptive. It meant they were running on borrowed time, every minute bringing them closer to the moment when the engines would cough, sputter, and die. Morrison made his way forward from the cargo bay, squeezing past the jury-rigged fuel tanks, stepping over equipment that had shifted during takeoff. He looked at the fuel gauges, at Stanley's calculations, at the grim expressions on the faces of the crew. He did not need to ask. He could read the situation as clearly as if it had been written in letters of fire. "How bad?" he asked quietly. "We might make it," Szrajer said. "Or we might have to ditch in the Adriatic. Make sure your men are wearing their life vests. If we go down fast. There won't be time for second chances." Morrison nodded slowly. He had survived being shot down over Germany, had survived 3 weeks hiding in occupied Poland, had survived the desperate rescue from that grass field with German patrols closing in. The idea that he might die now, so close to safety, seemed almost absurd. But war did not care about narrative satisfaction or poetic justice. War killed indiscriminately, and it killed right up until the moment it stopped. The Croatian coastline appeared ahead, a thin line between the grey-green of the land and the darker blue of the sea. Szrajer descended to 200 metres, low enough to see the waves, high enough to have a chance if the engines quit. The fuel gauges showed levels so low they might have been measuring hope rather than aviation gasoline. Wilson broke radio silence, transmitting the recognition codes to the RAF squadron at Vis Island. The response came back almost immediately, a British voice crackling through the static. Dakota 472, you are cleared for immediate landing. We have you on visual. Fire trucks and ambulance standing by. Fire trucks and ambulance. They knew. Somehow the controllers at WWII had figured out that the Dakota was flying on fumes, that this was not a routine supply run, but a desperate attempt to reach safety before gravity and mathematics caught up with them. Szrajer felt a strange gratitude for that British voice, for the understanding it contained, for the recognition that they were all in this together. The island of WWII appeared in the distance, a small shape rising from the Adriatic. The airfield was barely visible, a scratch in the landscape, but it was there. It was real. It existed. Szrajer could see the runway, could see aircraft parked in revetments, could see vehicles moving on the taxiways. 1 kilometre away. Less. The left engine coughed. The sound was subtle, barely audible over the normal engine roar, but Szrajer knew that cough. He had heard it before, in training, in emergencies, in the nightmares that came after missions went wrong. It was the sound of fuel starvation, of an engine beginning to die. He advanced the throttle on the left engine, trying to squeeze every last drop from the tanks. The engine responded briefly, then coughed again. The propeller windmilled, still turning but no longer providing thrust. The Dakota yawed to the left, the right engine trying to pull them in a circle. "We're not going to make the runway," Stanley said. His voice was utterly calm, the tone of a man stating a mathematical certainty. Szrajer looked at the distance. 800 meters to the airfield. But they were losing altitude, losing speed, the single remaining engine struggling to keep them aloft. The right engine was still running, still pulling, but it was not enough. Not with the weight they carried, not with the drag from the windmilling propeller on the left. He made his decision in seconds. "Ditching," he announced over the intercom. "Brace for water impact." There was no time for fear, no time for regret, just the mechanical process of preparing the aircraft for a controlled crash. Flaps down to reduce speed, nose up to flatten the descent angle, right engine at full power until the last possible second. The Adriatic rushed up to meet them, dark water that looked solid from this altitude, water that would hit them like concrete if he got the angle wrong. The Dakota touched the surface tail first, exactly as it was supposed to. The impact was violent but controlled, the fuselage shuddering, the tail section crumpling, water exploding over the windscreen. The right engine tore from its mount with a screech of rending metal. The propeller cartwheeled away across the waves. The aircraft skidded across the post. Water, slowing, tilting, and then it was floating, barely, the nose pointing skyward at an angle that would not hold for long. "Out! Everyone out!" The cargo door had jammed on impact, the frame twisted by the forces of the crash. Morrison and his men kicked at it, using their boots, their shoulders, everything they had. The door gave way with a groan, and seawater rushed in. The Dakota was sinking, the tail already submerged, the cockpit beginning to tilt backward as water flooded the cargo bay. Szrajer pulled himself from the pilot's seat, grabbed Stanley by the shoulder, pushed him toward the cargo bay. Davies was already moving, clutching his navigation charts and maps as if they mattered more than his own life. Wilson abandoned his radio set, following the others toward the weakening light of the cargo door. They jumped into the Adriatic, 9 rescued airmen and 4 RAF crew. 13 men struggling in the waves as the Dakota's nose lifted higher, higher, and then slipped beneath the surface with a sound like a great metal sigh. The aircraft was gone. 3,000 kilometers they had flown it, through darkness and danger and impossible circumstances, and in the end, it had brought them within sight of safety before giving up. RAF rescue boats were already cutting through the water, fast patrol craft that had launched from Vis Island the moment the Dakota went down. Strong hands pulled the men from the sea, wrapped them in blankets, administered first aid to those who needed it. The American with the leg fracture had re-injured it during the ditching and was crying out in pain. The one with dysentery had aspirated seawater and was vomiting over the side of the boat. But they were alive, all of them. Against every odd, against every reasonable expectation, they had made it. On the dock at Vis Island, medical personnel waited with stretchers and ambulances. An RAF intelligence officer stood with a clipboard, ready to debrief them, to extract every detail of the profus mission for the official records. A photographer from the Air Ministry stood nearby, camera ready, but no photographs would be taken. This mission did not exist. Operation Wildhorn Three would remain classified for decades. The rescued airmen would be told to say nothing about their time in Poland or the circumstances of their rescue. Szrajer sat on the dock, water dripping from his uniform, and watched the horizon where the Dakota had gone down. Major Kowalski and his home army soldiers had bought them those crucial minutes with the German patrol. Polish families had sheltered the airmen for weeks at risk of execution. The Dakota and its modifications represented months of work, resources the RAF could not spare but had sacrificed anyway, all of it for 9 men, 9 lives. In a war that consumed lives by the millions, was 9 enough to justify the cost? But then Morrison sat down beside him, and the American's hand gripped his shoulder with a force that spoke of emotion beyond words. "My wife," Morrison said, his voice breaking. "She's 8 months pregnant. I'm going to see my kid. Because of you. Because of those Polish soldiers. Because somehow, impossibly, this worked. 1 life, 9 lives. It did not matter. What mattered was that they had refused to accept that those men were lost, that someone had looked at the impossible distance, the impossible odds, and had said, yes, we will try. That Polish resistance fighters had risked everything for strangers who happened to be fighting the same enemy. That regulations had been broken, protocols ignored, sensible caution thrown aside for something that could not be measured in military doctrine or strategic value. Wing Commander Pickard arrived on V's Island by Spitfire 3 hours later. He found Szrajer in the officers' mess, drinking coffee that tasted of engine oil and survival. Pickard sat down across from him without speaking for a long moment. "The Dakota's a loss," he finally said. "The modifications can't be replicated without questions being asked. Operation Wildhorn is suspended indefinitely." He paused, then added more quietly, "But 9 men are going home. 9 families get their sons and husbands and fathers back. Command is not happy about the methods, but they're satisfied with the results." The Polish soldiers at the landing zone, Major Kowalski and his men, what happened to them? Pickard's expression gave him the answer before the words came. German reprisals. The villages nearby were burned. We don't know how many casualties. Resistance networks in the area have gone dark. The coffee turned to ash in Szrajer's mouth. He had known, of course, had understood from the moment Major Kowalski bought them time with that delaying action. But knowing and facing the reality were different things. Those Polish soldiers had traded their lives for 9 strangers, had done so willingly, without hesitation, because in the moral calculus of their war, saving Allied airmen mattered more than their own survival. They knew, Pickard said softly. They knew what would happen, and they did it anyway. That's what makes them heroes. But Szrajer took no comfort in the word. Heroes was what you called the dead when you needed to justify their sacrifice. Heroes was how you packaged grief and guilt into something noble. The men who died in that Polish forest were not heroes to him. They were fellow soldiers, comrades in a war against tyranny, people who had made an impossible choice because all their choices had been impossible since 1939. In the weeks that followed, the 9 rescued airmen were debriefed, processed, and sent home. Morrison returned to his pregnant wife in Illinois. The British navigator with the leg fracture was medically discharged and spent the rest of his life walking with a cane. The American with dysentery recovered but never again flew combat missions. Each of them carried the weight of their rescue, the knowledge that their survival had cost lives they would never know. Szrajer returned to operations, flying missions over Yugoslavia and Italy for the remainder of the war. He never spoke publicly about Operation Wildhorn Three. The mission remained classified long after the war ended, buried in archives that would not be opened for decades. When historians finally unearthed the story, they found fuel consumption reports, navigation logs, intelligence debriefings. But they could not find the thing that mattered most, the why. Why had Szrajer volunteered for a mission that violated every safety protocol? Why had Polish resistance fighters risked their lives for foreign airmen? Why had the RAF allocated resources it desperately needed for a rescue operation that saved only 9 men in a war that was killing thousands every day? The official records offered no answers because the answers were not things that could be recorded in military documents. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel